Is the government secretly manipulating house prices? Now, it might sound like a conspiracy, but what if it's not? Because the truth is, behind the scenes, politicians, the government, and even central bankers have hidden incentives to push house prices up and down when it suits them. So in this episode of the Property Academy podcast, you're going to learn the top 5 ways the government actually manipulates house prices, the secret incentives that politicians don't want you to notice, and the surprising levers that they use to control the housing market without you even realizing it.
Now, Andrew, we are counting down the top 5 ways that the government can and does manipulate house prices. What's number 5?
So number 5 is the wealth effect. And I often say to people, the dirty dark secret of politics is that every party wants house prices to go up, because when you've got a struggling economy, if you want people to spend money, the Reserve Bank changing the interest rate and house prices then going up, that actually results in people feeling a bit richer. And if we feel a bit richer, we spend more money. We tend to spend more money. And that's not just an assumption. The Reserve Bank actually talk about this openly on their website. And the quote is, they say, when house prices go up, homeowners feel better off financially and they actually tend to spend more money.
And I actually saw that piece of research, and what it showed is that if somebody's house goes up in value by $1, they tend to go out and spend 3 cents more. So if your house goes up in value by $10K, you go out and you spend an extra $300 more on average. But then again, if your house goes down in value by $10K, you spend $300 less. So it's not that the Reserve Bank is conspiring to keep houses high, right? That's not what we're saying.
No.
They're not sitting in a deep, dark room when they're setting monetary policy saying, how can we increase the house prices? But it does play into their consideration.
Yeah, it's absolutely part of kind of what they're thinking about. And right now, they're happy to take interest rates lower, and that causes house prices to go up a bit, and it'll probably build over time. And that is going to get people spending, because let's face it, the economy right now does need a bit of a boost of action. It does need a bit of activity, because right now it is quite ropey.
And so if they bring interest rates down, they might think, okay, part of what might happen to the economy is house prices go up a bit, people feel a bit wealthier, they start spending a little bit more. And since house prices have come down so much, people have cut back on their spending because they feel poorer. If house prices start to recover a bit, that negative effect will start to dissipate and go away a little bit. And it's not necessarily that like this manipulation is intentional, but it actually still does happen. You know, though sometimes it actually can be a little bit intentional, but I'll come back to that a little bit later as well. Now, if we think about the 4th biggest way that the government manipulates house prices, it's what I call the lock-in effect. So if we think about banks, and we've basically got 4 big ones here in New Zealand, and they run most of the economy, their biggest asset are the mortgages that they're lending out. Now, if house prices fall sharply, right, and they go massively down and property values drop, potentially even below their mortgage values, then that can create a lot of financial instability, because you've got all of these people in negative equity. And then the question is, well, what happens if they stop paying their mortgages and default? Their debt is bigger than the value of the asset, the house that it's secured against. And then that creates a risk that banks potentially lose a lot of money if they have to wind people up and can't recover those funds. And then the financial system starts to get a little bit rocky. And so the government and the Reserve Bank, they do prefer to avoid that risk. So they actually don't want house prices to crash down to 3 times income, which is kind of like widely considered to be the standard of what is affordable or not. But when you hear a lot of politicians talk about wanting house prices to be lower in the future, often they'll use words like they want house prices to moderate, or they want house prices to increase but at a more moderate pace. A lot of the time is that they don't actually want them to fall.
Yeah, and if you think back to like the pandemic, right? In the pandemic, there was this real concern and real risk that house prices were going to come crashing down. And at that time, we had those LVR restrictions in place like we do now today. But at that point, the Reserve Bank said, you know what, we're going to take those away temporarily, because they wanted to simulate the housing economy. They didn't want house prices dropping to a point where people felt poor, they had negative equity, and maybe just kind of would abandon their mortgages, and the market would just absolutely go to hell in a handbag.
And so
I stole your line.
You always love to steal my line. But often, especially because the people who have most recently purchased homes at elevated prices, higher prices, tend to be those first home buyers who don't have a lot of equity. And so when house prices fall a lot, that means that a lot of first home buyers aren't particularly happy.
And you think about, okay, yes, that has effect on the banking system, but how do you imagine, even though it's not the government's fault per se, if you're in negative equity, you can absolutely imagine that if all these first home buyers then have the housing market crash and they all feel poor, that's really going to put a dampener on their opinion about the government.
And that's the reason why that once house prices tend to go up, the government really wants to hold them there. They don't necessarily want them to fall massively. Even if you look at other restrictions we have, like the loan to value ratio restrictions or the debt to income ratios, which are only recently come out, they're there to make house prices more stable. It's not about them going down or even preventing them from going up to some degree in the future, but it's making sure that they don't jump up and down really wildly and really fast. It's really about locking in the current house prices in. Now, if we think about the third way that the government manipulates house prices, what would you say?
That's unintentional manipulation. So basically, anytime the government does something that they're wanting to help out an area over here, but it has an unintended consequence over here. So take first home buyers, for example, right? So these are young people trying to get into their first home, which makes us feel good as a nation, and we absolutely should be doing that. Now, the government, for example, introduces things like the first home buyers grant. So all of a sudden you get 5 to 10 grand, or maybe even up to 20 grand towards your deposit. Well, all of a sudden, there are more people in the market that have got larger deposits that can go and buy more expensive properties. Or you've got people or you've got things like the KiwiSaver rules, right? Being able to withdraw your KiwiSaver and again create a deposit faster than when I bought my first property. And yes, you need a lower deposit, but I had to save all of that as opposed to have it accidentally saved through my KiwiSaver fund. These kind of policies, while they're great, create more competition in the housing market and probably give people more ability to spend more than they otherwise were going to or able to.
And I know you're not saying that these are bad policies. They never should be in there. But the unintentional effect of having them and trying to move towards that very good outcome of more first home buyers and more Kiwis owning their own homes, the unintentional consequence of that is that the government has effectively manipulated house prices. In that case, they're effectively manipulating it up. Now, you could argue about, is manipulation the right word, or should it be impact or some other word? But the other incentive for manipulation is actually for the government's own balance sheet. So what a lot of people don't realize is that the government is one of the largest landowners in the country, and the government benefits from rising property values generally in a few ways. Firstly, tax revenue. So if we have that wealth effect that we talked about before, and people start going out and they start spending more money, well, the government is clipping the ticket on GST. So Andrew feels really rich now because he's got because his house has gone up in value, so he goes and buys a spa pool, right? And he spends
always a spa pool.
Well, it is in this case. He spent 11.5 grand on that spa pool. Well, $1,500 of that is going to the government in terms of GST. And so this idea of the wealth effect and property values going up, there is an incentive for the government to say, oh, well, that is actually going to help with our coffers. Now, whether they intentionally go and say, we're going to pump up house prices to get some more GST through the wealth effect, I'm not saying that's where they're all rubbing their hands around the cabinet table with glee saying, how can we pump it up? But there is the incentive there. That's what I'm saying. And then if we think about land ownership, the Crown Estate is estimated to, it's about 40% of the total area of New Zealand.
40%?
Oh, yeah. The government is a massive landowner. And even if we think about Kāinga Ora, what used to be Housing New Zealand, they own a shed load of property, I think they manage something like 72,000 properties all around New Zealand. Now, if house prices then go up, it makes the balance sheet of Kāinga Ora, KO, much, much better because now they're wealthier, they have more assets. And what does that mean? Well, they can then go to the banks and borrow even more money against those assets to do what? Go ahead and buy more houses to provide them for New Zealanders. That's a very nice, good thing. And it also makes the government wealthier. And so, again, we're not saying Nicola Willis is there rubbing her hands, but there is an incentive for the government to maintain stable or moderately rising house prices because it does benefit their balance sheet and it does benefit the amount of revenue they can get. But if we think about the last and the most important reason that the government has an incentive to manipulate house prices, what would you say?
Well, the last one, and I kind of alluded to it before, is political gain, right? So if you've got a nation of people who are seeing house prices drop and you're feeling poor and you don't want to go out and spend money and you can't leverage against your property to invest in your business or buy another property or invest in shares, if everything's just down in the dumps, well, you're far more likely to vote for the other guy, to vote for some change, than you are to maintain the status quo. And that has such a big impact. That's why I said before, like the dirty dark secret of politics is everyone wants house prices to go up. At what rate? That kind of depends on the party a lot of the time. But the reality is all governments or any party wants the house prices to be stable and or going up at whatever rate.
And that's because you're more likely to vote for the status quo if you feel like it's going quite well for you. And I started looking at a couple of international studies that back this up. And so there was this one that came out of Cambridge University, and they looked at 16 different advanced economies and democracies between 1960 and 2017. So we're talking about 57 odd years. And they found that, especially if it's a centre-right led government, that as house prices increase, people start saying, when they're asked, that they approve of the government. So government approval goes up as house prices increase, especially if the incumbent is on the centre right, because there is a bit of a status quo bias. You feel better about your own situation. And so you're more likely to say, yeah, this is going quite well for me. And I think that's often why governments will engage in what we call jawboning, which is just talking positively about the housing market and talking positively about house prices over the long term, which just gives people the confidence to buy without pulling a hard policy lever. Now, there is a bit of an exception to this. So Chris Bishop, who's the current housing minister, he's actually out there saying, I do want house prices to fall. Meanwhile, his boss, Christopher Luxon, is saying, I'd quite like them to increase.
Yeah, I found that quite interesting when I saw the contradicting kind of messaging at the moment. But I'm guessing, Christopher Luxon not polling as well as perhaps he'd want to. I could understand that he absolutely would want house prices to go in a more positive direction. And look, we're not saying that governments are these wicked puppet masters pulling the strings and, absolutely just manipulating house prices in a negative way to make you vote for them. We're not saying that at all, but we just have to be honest about the fact that, rising house prices do have a positive effect on people's opinion about the government, and governments, whilst there is a separation between the Reserve Bank and the government can have some impact on the direction of the market. So we just have to be realistic about that.
And that there are real incentives here. Like the Reserve Bank doesn't have an incentive to push house prices up 50% over the next 3 years. But at a time where they're trying to get the economy going, they do have an incentive to say, look, we'll allow house prices to go up a little bit. We won't worry too much about that because actually it's going to achieve what we want, which is getting the economy going again.
So that's how the government manipulates the housing market, sometimes on purpose, sometimes by accident, but always with big consequences for your wealth. And if you liked this video and want to learn how to grow your wealth with property, check out this one where you're going to learn the property blueprint to retire rich at 55. It's a step-by-step guide that shows you how to build a property portfolio in today's market. See you there.